Good evening and welcome to Off the Shelf. Tonight I'm reading Resident Evil Zero Hour Chapter 3. Enjoy. Rebecca watched as Billy stalked out of the train car, feeling impotent and very young. He didn't even look back, as though she wasn't worth worrying about. And apparently I'm not, she thought, her shoulders sagging. She hadn't expected him to be so, well, scary, big, muscular, with dark, steely eyes, and an intricate tribal tattoo covering his entire right arm. Both arms bared by a thin cotton undershirt. He looked tough, and after her terrifying run-in with the walking near dead, she hadn't been up to the task of taking him into custody. Not to mention, he got the drop on me. She'd found a lone corpse at the front of the car, one of the train workers, and had seen what looked like a key grasped in one cold hand. Since the only other door out of the car was locked, she had to try for it. It was that or go back through the passenger car. She'd been so involved in trying to retrieve the key without snipping the stiff fingers that she hadn't heard the convict approach. Not until it was too late. Now, as she walked back to the front of the car, she saw that the locked door used the card reader. Anyway, great. And so far she was doing just great. She turned and reached for her radio, ready to admit defeat. If she could get the team in fast enough, they'd handle Billy. More important, she wouldn't be alone with the knowledge that some kind of plague had hit Raccoon. It was funny that nabbing a convicted killer was suddenly lower on the list of priorities. Bam! Bam! Before she'd even touched the transmitter button, she heard 2 rounds fired in the next car, the direction Billy had gone. She hesitated, not sure what to do, and in that instant, a window exploded behind her. She spun, shards of glass flying, and saw a human figure falling to the floor. "Edward!" The mechanic didn't respond. Rebecca rushed to her teammate's side, quickly assessing his condition. Besides a massive open wound on his right shoulder, his face was gray with shock, his gaze bleary and unfocused. Every exposed part of his body was covered with contusions and abrasions. "Are you all right?" she asked, ripping her medkit open. Grabbing a thick gauze patch, she tore the package apart, applied it to his shoulder, realizing with a sinking sensation that it might not do much good from the massive amount of blood drenching his shirt. His subclavian had likely been severed. She was astounded that he was still alive, let alone that he'd had the strength to jump through a window. "What happened?" Edward rolled his head towards her, blinking slowly. His voice was taut with pain. "Worse than... we can't..." She held the bandage firmly, but it was already soaked through. He needed a hospital, ASAP, or he wasn't going to make it. Edward's voice was getting weaker. "You must be careful, Rebecca," he slurred. "Forest is full of zombies and monsters." She started to tell him not to talk anymore, to conserve his energy, when more glass exploded, slivers of it raining over them, the window just to their left shattering. 2 giant dark shapes leaped through the broken pane, one disappearing around a jag in the corridor, the other turning in their direction. Zombies and monsters. A dog. It was a big dog, but like no dog she ever seen before. It might have been a Doberman once, but as it bared dripping teeth at her, flaps of skin and muscle hanging from its haunches, she realized that it too had been infected by whatever disease had struck the train's passengers. It didn't just look dead, it looked destroyed. Its eyes filled with red, its body like some mad patchwork quilt of wet fern bloody tissue. Edward wouldn't be able to protect himself. Rebecca slowly rose and took a step back from the dying mechanic. Gun in hand, though she couldn't remember drawing it. She could hear the second dog panting farther along the corridor, out of sight. Oh, excuse me. She aimed for the animal's left eye, really understanding the true horror of the disease. Whatever it was, for the first time, her conflict with the near-dead passengers had been terrible, but so shocking she'd hardly had time to consider what it all meant. Now, looking at the stiff-legged, monstrous beast in front of her, its growl rising into a hellish whine of hunger, she remembered her childhood pet, a shaggy black lab mix named Donner, remembered how much she loved him, and understood that this had probably been someone's pet, too, just as those people she shot had once been human, had laughed and cried and come with families that would miss them, that would be destroyed by their loss. Disease, chemical spill, or attack, whatever had caused all this, it was an abomination. The understanding flashed through her mind in an instant and was gone. The dog tensed its shredded flanks, preparing to leap at her, and Rebecca squeezed the trigger, the 9mm rocking in her hands, the blast of sound defeating in the small space. The dog collapsed. Rebecca pivoted, aiming at the bit of corridor she could see, waiting for the second to appear. She didn't have to wait long. With a snarl, the animal leaped around the corner, its jaws wide. Rebecca fired, the shot hitting its chest, staggering the dog back with a high whine of pain. But it was still on its feet. It shook itself as though shaking off water, growling, readying to come at her again, even as dark ichorous blood poured from its wound. Should have killed it. That should have knocked it flat. Just like the people in the passenger car. It seemed that only a headshot would take it down. She raised her arm and fired again, this time hitting the center of its bullet-shaped skull. The dog fell, spasmed once, and went still. There could be more of them. She lowered the gun slightly, turning towards the broken windows and trying to see through the darkness and rain, straining to hear anything besides the storm. After a few beats, she gave up, kneeling next to Edward again, reaching into her pack for a fresh bandage, and stopped, staring at her teammate. The steady pump of blood from his shoulder wound was no more. She quickly felt for a pulse below his left ear, felt nothing at all. Edward gazed at the floor with half-open eyes, dead. "I'm sorry," she whispered, sitting back on her heels. It seemed inconceivable that he was gone, that he'd died in the short time she'd been shooting at the dog things, and a wash of guilt swept over her. If she'd been faster, if she'd packed his wound better. But you didn't, and the longer you sit here feeling bad about it, the more likely it is that you'll end up joining him. Get moving. Rebecca felt guilt at the insensitive thought, but a glance at the open windows got to her feet. She'd have to assess her culpability later, when it was safe to do so. Her radio beeped. She grabbed it, backing away from the windows. From poor Edward. Reception was bad, but she could tell it was Enrico. She held the speaker to her ear, hugely relieved to hear the captain's strong voice in between bursts of static. "You copy. More information on Cohen." Rebecca reluctantly stepped closer to the windows, hoping to hear better, but the static barely lifted. "Institutionalized. Killed at least 23 people. Careful." "What?" Rebecca pressed the transmit button. "Enrico, this is Rebecca. Do you hear me? Over." A wave of static. "Captain, Stars, Bravo, do you copy?" Long seconds of more static. She lost the signal. Rebecca put the radio back on her belt. She had to get to the copter to tell the others about Edward, about Billy and the train and the terrible danger they were all facing. She changed clips for the 9mm, taking a moment to reload the half-spent one. With a final sorrowful look at her fallen teammate, she stepped over a dog body, doing her best to avoid slipping in the pool of blood surrounding it, and started back toward the passenger car. Although she knew she should be eager to run across the missing convict to arrest him, she hoped she wouldn't see Billy again. Edward's death, the dogs. She felt unsteady, incapable of taking charge, and 23 people? She shuddered, amazed that he hadn't killed her when he'd had the chance. In the passenger car, she saw the result of the 2 shots she heard earlier. The diseased victim she thought had moved, but hadn't been sure about. It seemed he'd been alive after all. He must have tried to attack Billy, the way the others had gone after her. She paused at the door, back to the car she'd originally come through, looking over the decayed bodies of the people she'd killed. If Edward was right, if the woods were full of these things, she was going to have to move fast. And maybe Billy didn't kill those Marines. Rebecca blinked. It hadn't occurred to her earlier, but the Jeep may have been attacked, allowing Billy to escape, forcing him to run. In fact, it seemed likely that the 2 dead men had been mauled, not just shot. The dogs could have done it. She shook her head. It didn't matter. He was a killer either way. And if she wasn't up to the job of apprehending him, she'd better go get someone who could. As serious as the unknown sickness was, they couldn't just let Cohen run. She left the passenger car behind, hurrying through the empty car to the side door, hoping that the others were all back to the helicopter safe. She reached for the handle, lifted it. She wasn't sure how to break the news about Edward. That was going to be rough. Rebecca frowned, pushing at the sliding door, which was refusing to slide. She tried to handle again, then again, and then kicked the door, cursing silently. It was stuck, or Billy had locked it, maybe to keep her from following him. Damn! She chewed at her lower lip, remembering that key in the dead worker's hand. She hadn't managed to pull it free, and then had forgotten about it after her run-in with Billy. Not to mention Edward and the dogs. But then, who needed keys? She couldn't just as easily crawl out of the broken windows, no big deal. She heard a sound, a door closing, and locked to her left. Toward the back of the train, someone was moving around in the next car over. Another sick passenger, probably, or perhaps Billy was still on board. Either way, she was ready to get off, and she had her choice of windows exit. Unless it's someone else back there, someone who needs help. It could even be another of the stars, and now that she'd thought of it, she felt duty-bound to take a look, sensible or not. She walked quickly to the end of the empty car, readying herself for whatever would come next. It didn't seem possible that anything weirder could happen tonight, but then, most of what had already happened didn't seem possible. She wanted to be prepared for anything. She opened the door to the next car and took it in with a sweep of the 9mm. Vastly relieved to find it empty and blood-free. There were stairs going up on the left, a door straight ahead. That must have been the door she'd heard closing, and now an open. And out walked Billy Cohen. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll read the rest of this chapter some other time. Good night.